Hey, Glenn here, Monster Guitars. This is part 2 in a series about all the tools that you need if you want to become a guitar builder. In part 1, we looked at what you need to get started on a body. It's not quite finished yet, but we're getting there. But in part 2, we're going to be looking at all the thingies that you need if you're going to be building a guitar neck like this one here. So, let's check them out. So I haven't been using any new tools yet. I've only just started this video. I've used the plunge router, which you've already seen, and I've used it on this piece of Remu, which is going to be the neck, and I've used it to route out the channel for the truss rod. Most of the tools that we've used will do most of the work that we need going forward. There's just a couple of specialized tools you're going to see shortly. So I cheat slightly. You might think it's cheating. I don't. I just think it's what I do. My fretboards, I don't make my fretboards from scratch. So there are some tools that I'm avoiding here, and you can avoid them too if you just do what I do. I buy my fretboards roughly cut, so they haven't got a nice finished surface on them, but they're already cut out to dimensions, and they have the slots, the fret slots in them, and they have some inlays in there. It'll look much nicer once I've done the stuff that I do, namely sanding the radius onto the fretboard, sanding it finely, putting the frets on eventually, and oiling it up. But this is what I do. I'm putting the binding on. I'm using plastic binding, and here's a tool, I suppose. It's a pipette. I use that to put some acetone between the binding and the wood. Acetone will melt the surface of the plastic, and as it dries, it sticks itself to the binding. I'm just holding it on as it dries, and then I will tape it up as I have done on the other side. There we are. I'm binding the fretboard. It's a rainy day today on Saturday in the Monster Guitars workshop. I said that I would show you the result of the routing, and there it is. A truss rod that sits nicely in its channel, ready for me to glue the fretboard on, which I'm going to do next. There are no new tools involved in this. There will be a piece of wood, which I'm using as a clamping caul to press the neck on where I glue it. I'll be using glue and clamps, and let's go. And there we go. The reason that the clamps are not perfectly evenly spaced, I'm trying to talk over the rain, is that there is a bench leg there in the way, but that's okay. That's plenty of pressure, I believe. We're back at the bandsaw, a place that you've seen before, just to cut out the shape of the neck. I was thinking about which tools to use to trim the neck to the size and shape of the fretboard. I could have used my table router, and I would normally do that, but I'm trying to make it easy on you. I'm trying to show you that you don't need that many tools, or at least I'm trying to do this with as few tools as possible. So I'll go back to a tool that we've already used. So this is, as you know, my router, and there is a pattern bit on there. I'm going to do this so that the bearing rides along the edge of the fretboard while the bit cuts away the wood that overhangs the fretboard. There we go. And what I'll do is I'll just keep lowering the bit until it basically touches this work surface, which is an old piece of MDF. And so we will trim the whole neck to the shape of the fretboard, and then I'll get on to shaping the headstock. It's not easy to film this as I do it. You've seen this power sander before, the combination disc and belt sander. Do you have to use this? No, you could use the handheld random orbital sander for the straight line here and for the convex curve around there. I'm going to use my spindle sander for the concave, the inside curves now. And after that, the neck is now its final shape, at least in terms of the outline of the neck and the headstock. That's the shape it's going to be. Okay, so next I'm going to do something about the fact that that headstock is obviously too thick. And you've seen this many times before. Well, maybe not in the video, but you will have by now, trust me, if you're building a guitar. So I'm just sanding this nice and flat. That's a minor repair job because I must have been done by the bandsaw. I pulled off some of the binding, so I'm just sticking it back on. Then I'll sand that transition into a nice curve. So now it's time to introduce a new tool. This is called a radius sanding block. You'll know that a fretboard doesn't have a flat surface like this unfinished fretboard does. It has a curved surface, and that curve is called a radius because you can think of it as the circumference or part of the circumference of a circle, and you can measure the tightness of the curve by describing the radius or the size of that circle. You put the sandpaper on the radius block and you just sand back and forth like so. It's 80 grit paper on there at the moment, which is quite rough. Once I've fully shaped this, and you'll be able to tell because I'll be taking material off all the way across the block, because the shape of the block will now match the shape of the fretboard, then I'll start moving through the grits. So I'll go 120 grit, 240 grit, and then 400 grit. Maybe even 600. So that's got the radius on it, and it's now looking pretty nice. I sanded it right down to 600 grit, which is fairly fine, but then I went further with this synthetic steel wool, which is always a handy thing to have for the purposes of very fine sanding and polishing. I think this is probably 000. They come in grades from 00, well, they might even go coarser than that, but I use 00, 000, and then even finer, 000. Okay. What's next? Ah, yes, there is another tool coming up that we haven't seen yet. It's time to put some frets in. There are several ways of doing this. Here's one way I don't recommend. I bought this once because it looked gimmicky. Well, not gimmicky. It looked useful, but it's really more gimmicky. It's a handheld fret press for pressing frets down. It doesn't work that well. I mean, if you can make them work, good luck to you, but I don't recommend it. What I do have, but I can't find, is a fret press insert. It goes into your drill press. It just looks like that with a bit that goes into the drill press chuck that way, and you can put in coils based on the radius of the fretboard, and then you use your drill press to press the fret into the slot. That works really well. I just can't find it, so I'm going to use the traditional way, a hammer, and the hammer that you use should have soft faces. That one there is hard plastic, that one there is rubber, slightly softer, but both of them are much softer than the metal of your fret wire. That way your hammer will not leave scratches and dents in your frets, which will save you some tidy up work later on. Soft face hammer, really good idea. The frets that I'm using are pre-cut, which may seem like cheating. It does take some of the grunt work out of it, but they are stainless steel frets, and look, stainless steel frets are just hard work to work with. Cutting them is much more difficult, and these are really cool because you'll see the tang, that is the bottom part of the fret, is cut out right at the end, which is great because it means the crown, the top part of the fret, can sit over the binding and you don't have to worry about removing the tang, which you otherwise would. So let's just hammer these in. I usually get these centered just right, but I have my small hammer handy just in case they need a tap on the end. There we are. You want to be careful to hold the hammer flat, because if you get it coming on an angle, you'll make marks and possibly even dents on the fretboard. It's, it's not as hard as metal, but if you're hitting fairly hard, you could damage the wood. So, here's a new tool. It is variously called a leveling file. I think when I first bought it, it was referred to as a fret leveling file. I just refer to it as a fret file because it has multiple uses. And it's just a single cut file. It's just got the lines in one direction with basically its own truss rod that you can adjust to make sure that it's nice and precision flat with this comfortable handle. This one was made by Crimson Guitars. I do recommend it. I get nothing by saying that, but it's a very nice tool. The main thing that I use it for now is, having just put the frets in, I use it to trim the ends of the fret, which currently stick out and are quite sharp and uncomfortable. So I file the ends flush with the binding, like so. Okay, and the other thing that I use it for is beveling the ends of the frets. So you don't want the frets to have like a 90-degree angle straight up and down, so they have a sharp corner on them. What you want is for them to have a slight bevel, just a very slight one. You can decide what you're most comfortable with, but I put a very subtle bevel. So instead of sticking up 90 degrees, it's probably going to be sticking up at, 70 degrees, thereabouts. As these are stainless steel frets, you have to give it about twice as many passes as you would normally give it with a file. Here we go. So there's a bevel there that looks about right. Okay, now I will just do that on the other side of the fretboard now. I'm going to wrap things up now. What new tools have we required in mostly building the neck? It's almost finished. There are just a few more things to do. What new tools? Well, not many actually. Use sanders and routers. Incidentally, your first router should be a plunge router because you'll use that for the truss rod channel. That could be your only router if you like. New tools, what were they? Pipette for the acetone when you're sticking on the binding. If you're doing that, you might not be using acetone at all. Radius sanding block, absolutely essential. You will need those. You may need several if you're going to be using different radii on your fretboards. Soft face hammer, very handy. You can use a fret press, remember, but that's a useful way to hammer your frets in. Absolutely essential. Fret file, you must have one of those. They are really, really, really important. Those are the only new tools that we've used. Not many. There will be more in the next video, so stick around and you'll see what they are.